Okay, hey everybody, David Shapiro here with a video. By popular choice, we are covering AI and evolution. Will we become something else? Let's take a deep dive. Real quick, just a few seconds, I want to plug my Patreon. I am most of the way to my goal of $5,000 a month from Patreon supporters. Once I get there, I will demonetize all my videos permanently because I hate ads. It's a waste of time. Also, what you get if you do support me on Patreon is this is the primary way that I interact with people. I updated the tiers, so depending on how much interaction you want, whether you just want to ask a couple questions, or even if you want me to go so far as like looking at a proposal or a code, the higher tiers I will be happy to look at anything that you're working on, so long as it doesn't conflict with any NDAs. That's my only caveat is if there's anything that I have signed that I'm not allowed to share, I'll let you know. But beyond that, if you want to interact with me, Patreon is the best way to do so. I also generally accept all LinkedIn connections, but I don't always chat on LinkedIn. So, all right, with all that out of the way, here's the overview of what we're going to talk about today. So first, whenever you talk about evolution, you really got to set the stage and address any assumptions that you're making. Otherwise, people are going to be a little bit lost because evolution means different things to different people. So I just want to add some framing. So we'll start by talking about evolutionary pressures, which is what drives evolution in the first place. Second, we'll talk about tools and fire. We have been tool makers for a very long time. And so what I want to do is use this as an example to show you how technology has already modified our evolutionary trajectory. Fast forwarding, we'll talk about mechanization in the Industrial Revolution and how technologies like airplanes and tractors have already impacted our evolution. Now, that's just setting the stage. Again, we'll jump into various AI technologies. So CRISPR, I know, is not strictly a AI technology, but AlphaFold is, and those two go together like peanut butter and jelly. So we'll talk about how these technologies might have a very direct impact on evolution. Next, we'll talk about whether or not AI is going to make us smarter or dumber. This is a question that comes up a lot with tools like ChatGPT. A lot of people are thinking, man, this is going to make all of us dumber. Maybe. We'll take that apart once we get there. Next, we'll talk about post-scarcity. So basically, what happens if AI means that we don't have to work anymore? How does that change our relationship to each other, to ourselves, and how might that influence our trajectory in evolution? The last AI topic will be AI in dating. So from an evolutionary perspective, this is called mate selection or sexual selection. So how will AI impact who we choose to have children with? Because that is one of the primary drivers of evolution. And finally, we'll touch on the ethics and ramifications of all this stuff. What are the pros and cons of allowing AI to influence our evolution? Okay, so first, we've got evolutionary pressures. For those not in the know, evolution was defined super simple as if you have variation and selection, you must have evolution. Those were the words of Charles Darwin, the father of our modern theory of evolution. And of course, this theory has panned out. So far, so good. It stands up to pretty much all scrutiny. There are a lot of nuances. I can hear some people already saying, well, actually, we're not going to go into the nuances of evolution. Point being, though, is species change over time. Now, the primary method of evolution is what's called natural selection. So natural selection, you might have heard survival of the fittest, which basically, so fittest is not like physical fitness, not like how like jacked you are. It's how well you fit into your evolutionary role. So our fitness, and fitness is primarily measured by number of viable offspring. So if an organism has more viable offspring, it is said to have higher fitness. That is the primary indicator. That is the KPI, if you want to use a technology term, of fitness. The more babies you have that make it to adulthood and also procreate, the higher your fitness. It has nothing specifically to do with adaptation because individuals cannot adapt, but a species can adapt as a whole over time through higher fitness. Sexual selection, which I just mentioned a moment ago, is who you choose to have children with. This is a really interesting way. So the evolution of gender or sexual differences was a really powerful innovation. And there's a reason, is because it allows for really quick recombination rather than cloning, which is much slower. And that's how like bacteria evolve. Although I will say that there are plenty of bacteria that have lateral gene transfer without sexual reproduction, but sexual reproduction has immense benefits for evolution, and that's why it's here. Gene flow. So gene flow is as populations move, you get admixture, or you get different you get different genetic populations, and they change over time. So that's gene flow. Genetic drift is how genes might change within a population over time, based on interspecies competition, so competition between one species and another, that can cause genetic drift, or intraspecies competition. So that's competition within the species can also cause genetic drift. So the species itself might have some kind of sexual antagonism, like peacocks and peahens. So peacocks have their big giant plumage. They probably didn't always have that. And so sexual selection, genetic drift within that population caused them to get the plumage, which actually is maladaptive. Peacocks with their big plumage are more likely to get attacked and eaten, so there's a huge cost to that. And then finally, mutation. So one thing that's really important to remember is that a lot of evolution and a lot of genetic variation has nothing to do with mutations. I think I read a while ago, on average, the average like human child has only 30 total genetic mutations from their parents out of, what is it, 3 billion genes or whatever? I don't remember, or 3 billion base pairs. I think we have 30,000 genes and about 3 billion base pairs. So out of all of that, we only have 30 unique mutations, or single nucleotide polymorphisms, SNPs. And so that tells you how efficient and reliable our genetic copying machinery is. But it does happen, and so genetic mutations are very, very slow. However, genetic recombinations are much faster, which is why sexual selection is such a powerhouse when it comes to evolution. It is definitely OP. I would love to see a Tier Zoo video on sexual reproduction versus asexual reproduction. Anyways, I'm that kind of nerd. Okay, so that is how natural selection happens, but what are the pressures that drive evolution? First, food. Food is absolutely the number one most powerful driver of evolution, because if you don't have food, you starve. So the more things that you can eat, or the better you are at getting, finding, and controlling food, the better you do. Humans are apex predators and omnivores. We can eat just about anything. We can even eat poisonous stuff because we can figure out how to cook it and make it not poisonous. Like, look at pufferfish and plants from the nightshade family and all kinds of stuff. We can domesticate crops, cereal crops, grains. We can domesticate cows. We mastered food, and we'll get into more details in that later. So actually, I'll stop myself there. Environmental change is another huge driver of evolution. As the climate changes, it gets hotter, it gets warmer, it gets colder, drier, wetter, whatever. Those create immense pressures on species and individuals. And you can have sudden environmental changes. So like you might have a period with a lot of volcanic activity, which puts particulates in the atmosphere, which usually causes global cooling. Not always, but usually. You can also have changes in solar behavior. It has been hypothesized that Earth's position in the solar system and in the galaxy actually changes our exposure to things like cosmic rays over time. So there are cyclical extinctions that happen every now and then, and they're so regular that it looks like maybe it has to do with like where we are in the cosmos. Excuse me. So that can be an example of an environmental change. Stuff from way out in space might impact evolution. And then on a more mundane level, predation. We don't have to worry about that because we are the predators now. But certainly other animals and ancient humans had to worry about getting eaten by like bears and saber-toothed tigers and stuff. Disease, that is still a big one. So who is susceptible to what diseases, whether they are autologous diseases. So cancer is an example of a disease that comes from within. or it's an external disease like flu and viruses and MRSA, methicillin-resistant staphylococcus, right? So diseases, your resistance to disease. One of the biggest drivers of human evolution was the Black Plague, which actually, since it killed like a third of all population in Europe, what it did was it left the people who were just happened to be more genetically resistant to those diseases. And so what's interesting is that every now and then archaeologists will excavate some pits from around the Dark Ages, or even going back to the Roman ages, and they'll find bacterium that they think were the cause of the plague. And when they identify the species of bacterium, it's like, this doesn't even cause a skin rash today. And so that tells you that evolution, because of our travel, our globalization, we get exposed to so many diseases, and we have actually evolved to be so much more resistant to disease that I always laugh because every time travel movie, if you even go back 50 years, you will be the bringer of death. You will be the plague bearer, let alone if you go back 500 years. Everyone you meet, if you go back in time, will die because the bugs on your skin and in your body will kill everyone. So don't do time travel, kids. That's probably why we don't have any time travelers from the future. Even if time travel is possible in the future, they'd be like, no, if we go back, we're going to kill everyone. That is how much our evolution has progressed in terms of immunology just in the last few hundred years. And then finally, competition. I already talked about inter and intra-species competition, so I don't need to go over that. Okay, so with all that in mind, you are now primed to understand what drives evolution. So talking about humans specifically, we are the tool makers. We make and use tools and have been doing so since Paleolithic times. Since even before modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, we have been tool makers and tool users, whether it's stone, bone, wood, threads, whatever. Now, our ability to use tools required fine motor control. So that fine motor control is controlled in the brainstem and cerebellum, but it also requires more planning and thinking ahead. So in the book On Task, he taught the opening, I think it's the introduction or the first chapter, talks about how using tools, finding materials, this requires a lot more cognitive control, which cognitive control happens in the prefrontal cortex. So our entire brain, from the most primitive structures to the most sophisticated structures, go into tool making and tool use. Now, what does that do for us, and how does that shape evolution? One of the primary things that it does is it gives us access to new food. So if we come up with a bow and arrow and suddenly or a spear and we can take down a woolly mammoth has like 1 billion calories. I don't know if it's that much, but let's just assume that a woolly mammoth has millions of calories, right? That's enough to feed your entire village for like a month. I don't know if that's how long it lasts, but basically having new dietary options really changes your evolutionary trajectory. And because we had such a huge advantage of tool use, evolution doubled down on that. And so it's like, hey, we just unlocked this new skill tree, so let's keep spamming that skill tree because it's a really good one. Tool use, overpowered. Another thing that we did was we mastered fire. So fire does a lot of things for us. One, it allows us to cook food, which again expands our dietary options even further. So between tool use and fire, that's why we are omnivores. We can eat everything. Now, that being said, because cooked food is easier to eat and digest, our stomachs became less acidic, our jaws became smaller, as did our teeth, and weaker. And all of that also spoke to, we were already social, at least we think we were already social, but communal hunting efforts and gathering efforts and then agrarian society had huge social implications. And so tools and fire probably helped drive all the machinery that eventually gave rise to civilization. And then social, like civilization and social tribes, social units, that is another driver of evolution, because you have to be smarter in order to learn language, for instance. Because at some point in the ancient history, we didn't have a language, but at some point we did get language. And so that was an evolutionary thing where it's like, okay, how do you squish air out of your face and then make like meaningful sounds that someone else can understand. I could make tons of videos on this. This has been like, I've read books about this forever and talked with people. So anyways, once you get more sophisticated around tool making and tool use, that unlocks a whole new skill tree. You can make clothes, you can make shoes, which thick clothes, that allows you to get out of hot climates and into cold climates that you otherwise couldn't survive in. It allows you to build huts and boats and all kinds of stuff that allows you to continue to expand across the globe. So tool use and fire are like super overpowered, and that is why humans were a global species even before we had modern technology. Okay, we were already global, but you fast forward to the Industrial Revolution, we invent steamships, airplanes, airliners, and industrial agriculture, and this continues to influence evolution. It's too soon to really say like, oh, this is the way that it's going to impact evolution, but it absolutely is. And so remember how gene flow is one of the drivers of evolution. When you can be born in India and then move to America or vice versa, you can literally go halfway around the world, start a family, then your kids can go elsewhere. You can, like there's people on the East Coast that go to the West Coast. There's people that go to Europe and Europeans come here, go to Africa, Australia, whatever. So we have more gene flow in the human species than we have ever seen. And it is impossible to predict how that's going to happen or how that's going to impact evolution, but it absolutely is. It also allows for invasive species. So just as an example of how mass transit, global transit can impact evolution, when you introduce an invasive species, whether it's on accident or on purpose, it will have an impact on the local ecology. So humans, we are an invasive species. At least that's one way of looking at it. Our cats, domestic cats, are one of the worst invasive species. Oh, and by the way, they exist on every continent, including Antarctica. I think, though, that the cats on Antarctica, if humans were to leave Antarctica, the cats would probably all freeze and starve. But there's plants. In the south, we have kudzu. That's an invasive species that came from Asia. There's invasive bugs. There's the pine beetles and oak beetles and whatever else that are killing other things. And then there's frogs and cane toads. These all impact their local ecosystem by modifying ecological equilibriums and that sort of stuff. Now, from a human perspective, what we are seeing is what you might call a mutt, right? I remember I was on OkCupid probably 12 years ago, and there's a girl who called herself an Eastern European mutt. And I was just like, okay, cool. But basically, because of this, we've had about a century and a half of global transit, where it's even cheaper today, where almost anyone can travel thousands of miles to start a new family. This creates what's called heterosis. So heterosis is basically hybridization, which this often masks or reduces the expression of genetic diseases. And so, like, if you take someone who is from a particular population, like sub-Saharan Africa, they might have certain predilections towards certain diseases, like maybe diabetes or whatever. But then, if you take that sub-Saharan African and let's say they have children with a Northern European person, and their children are a perfect hybrid of these two very distinct genetic populations, that child is very likely to be healthier than either parent. We see this in dogs, so this is why mutts are much healthier than purebreds, and this is why I will pretty much never, ever adopt a purebred dog. My dog that you sometimes see in my videos, he's 12 years old and still runs at full speed. And he has his hearing, he has his sight, whereas a German Shepherd, which is part of what he is, would probably be dead by 12 years, honestly. So heterosis, good thing. Overpowered. So get on an airplane, do your species a favor, and find an exotic person to have children. No, don't do that. I'm not telling you what to do. Just pointing out that heterosis is a good thing. And actually, it is suspected that this is why this is for both men and women, why we find exotic people more attractive is because it's like, ooh, she's pretty. She doesn't look like the local girls. I want some of that. And then same thing for women too. I remember I watched a video many years ago of an American woman who went to Japan, and she was talking about like I'm exotic now. This is weird. All the Japanese men like me because like I'm the white woman. It's very interesting. So point being though is there is some genetic reason and benefit to being interested in exotic people. Now that being said, don't objectify people. Don't just try and get a notch in your belt. So we're already touching on the ethics and stuff. Anyways, moving right along. Industrialization had a lot of impacts above and beyond transit. There was mechanized agriculture. So with the advent of modern agriculture, industrial scale agriculture, we suddenly had way more calories than ever before. Part of the reason that we did this was actually during World War II, the United States Army, they created a schedule of like measuring recruits based on their like physical strength, stamina, weight, height, everything. And what they found was that a lot of Americans were actually too malnourished to even join the army. And the military was like, yeah, that's no good. In case of future wars, we need to make sure that we have a lot of, strong, young, healthy men in order to recruit them. And so what they did was in the aftermath of World War II, there was a lot of nutrition programs. And that's actually one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons that we have corn subsidies still, was because it's like, hey, a lot of these kids, a lot of these young men are too skinny because they didn't get enough calories. So we need to get everyone up to grade A, which means we need cheap, efficient calories. And one of the ways that we achieved that was through corn subsidies and the invention of high fructose corn syrup, which turned out to be a double-edged sword because high fructose corn syrup is not the best metabolically speaking. But all that being said, that was an unintended consequence of solving the calorie problem, which we're now figuring out, right? We're getting better at eating healthy, understanding what foods are good for us and what foods are bad for us and why. But the point being is that as a species, in the last 100 years, we solved calorie problems pretty much permanently. We produce enough calories as a species that nobody has to go hungry. The problem now is distribution and allocation, which we will talk about closer to the end of the video, which AI could probably help with. Finally, science and medicine in particular have removed certain constraints or bottlenecks. So for instance, I already mentioned that our immune systems are stronger than they were before, and that's partially due to medicine though. Vaccinations, we can artificially make it's not, I don't want to say artificially, that's not the right word, but we can make our immune system stronger through these controlled exposures, which means that we are now more resilient and we didn't have to use evolution to do that. That being said, it's going to be really difficult because modern medicine is also like 100 years old. It's going to be really difficult to figure out how modern medicine is going to impact evolution in the long run. And AI is just going to turn that up to 11. Yes, so AlphaFold and CRISPR. Basically, if you're not familiar, AlphaFold allows us to predict the shape and structure of proteins, how it folds. This is a really difficult problem because you're basically simulating gigantic molecules with a lot of really complex internal interactions, and it's super mathematically intensive. AlphaFold 2 basically solves this problem. It's not perfect, but AlphaFold 3 and other technologies, they're going to solve that perfectly. So what this does is it allows us to figure out why certain genes or genetic combinations result in diseases. Now, you might say, oh, well, between AlphaFold and CRISPR, we're going to cure all genetic disease. It's only a few years away. It's not that easy, unfortunately. So one reason is that there are very few bad genes. There are a few genes and copy errors and genetic variants that are just known to guarantee a disease. But most diseases are not single genes. So for instance, with autism, more than 200 genes and then all of their variants are associated with the predilection for it. And so genes are not really deterministic, except in a few small cases. So there's a lot of really complex interactions because it's not just genes, right? The metabolic pathways in the body, which is an emergent aspect of being a complex organism. Genes is just like the foundation, right? If you were to analogize genes to like the architecture of a building, the genes is just like the concrete foundation. Then you still have the rest of the building. You got all the plumbing, you got all the wiring, you've got the, all the other systems that go into it. So you need the foundation, but that's not all you need. You need a lot more than that. So that all said, okay, if it's super complicated, how are these AI technologies going to impact evolution? Well, like I just said a minute ago, medicine is huge, and it's really difficult to figure out how that's going to impact evolution in the long run. But right off the cuff, what it looks like genetic medicine and AI is going to do is allow us to cure things like cancer, Alzheimer's, diabetes, and other stuff. So imagine that we get rid of all known diseases. And then, so that, I mean, that alone will change a lot for us. Then, aging and longevity, I think that this is going to far and away have the biggest impact on evolution. And so what I mean by that is if we can stop aging, if we all get to the point where we have an indefinitely long lifespan, which I predict is going to happen certainly within my lifetime, does that mean that evolution stops? That is probably worth a lot of discussion on its own, because what happens if through medicine and AI we cure all causes of diseases, right? What if we get rid of aging, we have rejuvenation therapies, and suddenly we don't even need to have children that often because we live forever. That could be a huge impact on evolution. So I'm not saying that I predict that, but I'm just pointing out the possibility that like it is hypothetically, conceivably within the realm of possibilities that if 8 billion people alive today all stop dying, maybe evolution stops too. Now, on that cheery note, one of the biggest questions that people ask is AI going to make us smarter or dumber? So there's the sociological phenomenon aspect, which is education and so on. But then how does that interact with evolution? So first, let's just look at how AI might impact education. So given every opportunity, I will smash that Star Trek button. So this scene came from Star Trek Voyager, where Naomi Wildman, who was born on the ship, she is often used to explore like what education and what childhood might be like in the future. And one of the things that she does is she goes to the holodeck to learn. And so she learns from these basically video game characters. What the holodeck is basically just virtual reality. So she is constantly exploring and learning at a level that is optimized for her. And so she's supposed to be like 8 years old and already knows calculus. So one thing that I see as a possibility is that AI could help create highly personalized education experiences and incredibly rich learning environments that allow all children to get closer to their maximum natural potential. So that's one thing. So keep that in mind. Another thing that AI has the possibility of doing is improving access to information and education globally. So for instance, ChatGPT is much, much cheaper than a high quality tutor. And even though it's not quite as good, it's still a whole lot better than nothing. And then finally, maybe these AI tutors and AI tools could be designed to challenge you, to challenge your ways of thinking. And so for those of you familiar with my open source project Raven, one of the core objective functions of this AI machine, I call it an ACE, an autonomous cognitive entity. One of the core objective functions is to increase understanding, and that is one of the points of that objective function, is to challenge your way of thinking and make sure that you understand and believe that you understand the things that you believe, and to challenge those beliefs so that you can raise your level of understanding. So I think that AI will allow us to create entities and tutors that'll actually keep us honest. It might not be deployed that way, but I think we could. Now, that being said, there are absolutely some potential problems with AI and education and information. So one is over-reliance. Just do it for me, right? If we do succeed in creating autonomous cognitive entities, they might take over the lion's share of our cognitive labor, which means that we're just going to be like, I'm not going to challenge myself. It's too hard. Another possibility is echo chambers and bubbles. That's already a problem. But imagine that you have an AI companion that is designed to only cater to your ego and never challenge you, then your echo chamber gets out of the internet and into your daily life. So that could be a big problem. Now, that being said, I still predict that we're going to have a huge net gain in terms of our intellectual capabilities, especially from a global perspective, because you look at the fact that globally we will raise the floor, we will raise the minimum threshold of education and increase the amount of information that everyone has access to. And if we become smarter as a planet, as a species, that will absolutely impact evolution. Really difficult to figure out how, but it could be woven into some of this stuff, and we'll unpack some of this in the recap at the end. Finally, or not finally, but next, post-scarcity economics. No matter what happens, AI is going to impact jobs and economics. Will there be more jobs or less? Personally, I think less. I think that we will have 70% unemployment by 2030. Even if I'm wrong, AI is still going to change work and how we relate to work. So if I'm right and we start getting super high levels of unemployment, we will need to move to a redistribution or allocation model. And what that means is basically a robot tax. If companies or individuals or governments or whoever produce value with robots, they'll probably be taxed at a higher rate so that that value can be redistributed to everyone else. AI can help with those allocation of resources. So I mentioned food earlier. We already produce enough food to feed everyone. The problem is distribution and allocation. Maybe AI can help solve hunger permanently. Maybe AI can help solve housing permanently, because also we have enough housing units for everyone. The problem is allocation. And then when you start thinking about all these things that AI could possibly help with, you think the overall quality of life for everyone could go up. And I mean everyone, like not just Americans, not just Europeans, globally. Quality of life could go up globally. So if that happens, what else might change? Well, number one, our priorities and values are going to have to change. Right now, we are hyper individualistic, we are hyper competitive, and we have crab mentality. So one of the things that I do is I always plug this is post-nihilism. I suspect that we will have to change our identity as a species away from career, away from work, and towards valuing life more intrinsically. And so that's what I call post-nihilism. Another thing that might change is fertility rates. The question becomes, do fertility rates go up or down? Because here's the thing. If suddenly you don't need to work to make ends meet, you are free to choose what you want to do. Imagine if you suddenly it's like, oh, you get the equivalent of $15,000 every month just by virtue of existing, right? That's a pretty intoxicating idea. If you want children, you absolutely could afford it then. But you might choose not to because it's like, what's the rush, right? Especially if we have much longer lifespans. If you know that you're probably going to live 500 years, 5,000 years, what's the rush? So evolution might slow down or it might speed up. One thing that I think that very well could happen, and we'll talk about this actually, no, I'll put this off, in terms of reproduction rate. I've got a slide for that. So what happens if we don't work? What happens if we are given the freedom to self-determine? We'll spend more time in nature, we'll spend more time playing, and more time with friends and family. Now, some of you might know I recently quit my day job. And so from personal experience, I will say it is not that hard to adapt and change your identity and say, you know what, I actually don't identify with my career anymore. In fact, looking back, I didn't identify with my career for, say, 75% of my career. It was just a job. What I really identify with is what I'm doing right now. I identify with AI and communication and teaching people and helping the world. I happen to get rewarded for it, but I started doing this long before I got rewarded for it. We love, and when I say we, I mean humans. We love challenges and interesting experiences. That's why video games are so popular, is because it is a carefully curated, challenging experience. That's not going to change. Whether or not we have AI for jobs or not, that it is in our nature to love challenges and experiences. So what AI might do is unlock us to have even more interesting challenges and even more interesting experiences. How will that shape evolution? Difficult to say, but it almost certainly will. AI and dating. So we talked about sexual selection earlier in the video. Mate selection is deliberately or accidentally choosing partners that concentrate characteristics. So what are you selecting for, right? What I mean by that, an example is selecting for intellect or proxies of intellect. So if you have a graduate degree, you are something like 4 times more likely to marry someone and by extension have children with someone else who also has a graduate degree. Now, I'm not saying that there's a gene for getting a PhD. However, like any other complex behavior, there are going to be at least a handful of genes that enable that behavior or support that behavior. So, for instance, people that get doctorate degrees, they're more likely to be good at reading and good at thinking abstractly, and so on and so forth. So, if there are genes that are associated with some of those cognitive abilities and behaviors, then they're going to concentrate in people with graduate degrees. Conversely, we also select for physical attractiveness, socioeconomic status, and again, a lot of these are emergent characteristics. I'm not saying that there's a gene for rich, there's not a gene for fit, but there are many, many genes and genetic combinations that speak to those emergent characteristics, and they tend to get concentrated. I think the term for this is stratification. I don't remember. Anyways, there is a term for that where it's like, genetic drift, right? It's a kind of form of internal competition that can result in genetic drift. So animal husbandry is what we have done for many thousands of years, which is deliberately selecting animals and breeding those animals together to get the traits that we want. That's how we have such like chubby chickens that produce so much meat. It's how we have like big beefy cows. It's how we have super powerful cereal crops. Then, of course, we add in genetic engineering into that, and we can accelerate that even further. But animal husbandry and breeding programs are already a form of genetic engineering. So, what about human husbandry? And I don't mean like arranged marriages and stuff. Although arranged marriages do happen, but what I mean is, what if we deliberately select people based on genetics? There's already genetic matching dating services out there. As AI advances and other technologies like genetic sequencing and other stuff happens, it is entirely possible that we will soon have the ability to like go to a genetic counselor and get give a drop of blood for both parents. So like you could go to a genetic counselor. So this was explored in Gattaca and a few other movies. But basically, you can select a partner based on genetic match if you want to have children. But you could also select egg and sperm donors or surrogates or whatever based on either selecting for positive traits or selecting against undesirable traits. So, for instance, one of the things that they already do, and I don't know if this is still true, but someone told me this once. Let me know in the comments if it is true. But like, if you want to be a sperm donor, like you have to be over 6 feet tall and you have to have a graduate degree or something like that. And it's just like, oh, so you've already decided like these are positive characteristics that you want to select for. I don't know if it's true. Maybe it was true and it's no longer true. I don't know. Anyways, point being is that you can look for these emergent qualities and select for them, family history, that sort of stuff. But AI could help accelerate that. It may or may not have any impact there. Something that I think will have a lot more direct impact on family planning, which by extension will impact evolution, is going to be AI therapy and AI companions. So AI therapy is going to result in healthier people, better relationships, and therefore will impact families. So people that may not have had children very well could end up having children by virtue of having been had mate selection, dating helped with AI. They become healthier people. They connect with better people. They, go out into the wild. They find each other and they say, let's start a family. So you could have a lot of knock-on effects that AI does to help modify or influence sexual selection. This was in the movie Her. So the conclusion of the movie Her was that the AI all decided collectively, we need to remove ourselves and help humans reconnect with each other because that's what's going to be best for the species. It's entirely possible that that's going to happen naturally. And then finally, AI companions. So if you look out there, there's lots of people, like Replica is the number one, like sexy chatbot or whatever. So, cat girl robot girlfriends instead of real people. This might cause some people to drop out of the procreation race altogether. There are certainly people on the internet that are like, "Oh, I would much rather date a robot than a real person." And actually, I was corrected on this from a previous video where I assumed that it was predominantly men, but plenty of people pointed out that there's lots of women that are in the same camp. So what if AI helps some people just drop out of sexual selection altogether? Some people do already. There was a genetic survey that I read many years ago that came to the conclusion that only 30% of men contribute to subsequent generations, contribute genetic material to subsequent generations. So already, even before AI, 70% of men never have children. And that is not true of women. The vast majority of women do have children. So there's a lot of, this is called sexual antagonism, which is evolutionary pressure between the genders, between the sexes of a species. But what I'm thinking is that for those that want family, that want children, AI is going to help facilitate that and accelerate that. And for those that don't, it's going to allow them to check out of the procreation pool altogether. So what that might do is that maybe 500 years from now, 1,000 years from now, 50,000 years from now, we will have been selecting for people that want children. So it might become embedded in our nature that just by virtue of those who pass on their genes are people that want children are going to be people that are more family oriented, and whatever genes contribute to that sense of connection, that sense of belonging, and the desire for children could be magnified. This is highly speculative, but this is one thing that I actually predict in my novel that I'm working on, is that in the future, if we go this route, it could be that everyone, because up until now, procreation has largely been like socially driven, like you're required to carry on the line of your family. But my generation and younger, they're like, heck with that idea. Not doing that. So then, by virtue, the people who want children are the ones. Anyways, you get the idea. All right, so finally, the ethics and ramifications of all this. Playing God. Who has the right to decide what is good and what should be selected for? Who has the right to guide or steer our evolution? Well, one thing that I want to point out is that the rich and the reckless have been doing this anyways. The people with more privilege have always tried to stack things in their favor, right? Whether it's, rich men look for trophy wives or whatever. People will always try and do the best. And so many people, whether it's deliberate and conscious, right? Like, oh, I want to have the best children because having good children, whether it's a good genetic pedigree or whatever, is a point of pride for a lot of people. And so then we've been doing this for centuries. AI is just going to support that, right? Whether it's through genetic technology or genetic matchmaking or AI tutors, whatever, it's going to be the same story, just, with a new shiny technology. So I don't think that's going to really change anything. Now, one thing that could be bad is unintended consequences. Because what if we decide to, add a new gene to our children, and it turns out that gene causes immense suffering or random diseases later on? That could be really bad. So there's a very strong argument for just letting nature run its course. That being said, we don't really let nature run its course anyways. We have vaccines, we have antibiotics, we already do genetic screening on embryos. And so like if your fetus or embryo has certain genetic abnormalities, it might be recommended that you have an abortion. So we're already using some of this technology to at least select against known problems. We don't necessarily select for things, but we certainly select against things. So we don't really let nature run its course already, but it remains to be seen of how AI might influence that further. But as I mentioned, inequality, privilege, and access are likely to be the biggest ethical questions. So, and the number one question there is, will it be expensive? I actually suspect that AI and all the downstream technologies that like AI influenced medicine, AI influenced genetics, all of this stuff is actually going to be really cheap and really universal. So remember post-scarcity economics? Post-scarcity economics means that everything that you need is essentially free or so cheap that it doesn't really matter. And that could extend to like mRNA vaccines, right? We just had a global event that caused us to produce literally, I think, hundreds of billions or tens of billions of mRNA vaccines in a few months, right? Or a year or so. What happens when a vaccine for all cancer, for all diabetes comes out? Just the economic benefit of vaccinating everyone against cancer and diabetes and Alzheimer's and high cholesterol and heart disease and all that stuff, just the economic benefit would be great, right? And then if it's as cheap as an mRNA vaccine, costs $60, $6, whatever, I think that a lot of this stuff is going to be so cheap that it's just going to be brain dead simple that everyone should get it, or at least everyone should be given the option. I'm a big believer in consent. So I personally suspect that privilege is going to be less of an issue than people fear. Certainly the rich are going to have access to it sooner, while it's still expensive. So, because 15 years ago, genetic sequencing was still like $30,000 a shot, and it wasn't that particularly valuable, but then only the rich could afford it. And now it's, what, $300 a shot? It's almost getting to the point where like anyone can afford to have their genes sequenced. And so over time, because of AI, and two, because of the incentives to make this stuff cheaper, I think that it's going to be universally accessible within a reasonable period of time. All right, so in conclusion, here are some key takeaways and predictions. First, remember that tools and technology have already had huge impacts on our evolution for literally millions of years. AI is just another tool. Just like how tractors and planes, just another tool, just another technology. Personally, I think that genetic tech and AI with medicine is going to have the biggest direct impact on evolution through curing disease and increasing longevity. I honestly think that human evolution might really slow down in some respects, that natural human evolution might slow down a lot due to genetic medicine and longevity. That being said, if we can run simulations and genetically engineer our children might be more different than, like 10 generations in the past. So we might be the first species to take full control over our evolution. And that can be done through mate selection. It can be done through genetic simulations, AlphaFold. Like, imagine that you can just run all of your child's genes through AlphaFold, probably 6, and it'll say, okay, your child's metabolism is going to have this, this, and this, and they're going to have these characteristics, so on and so forth. So that will probably have the largest direct impact. So it's kind of like evolution will slow down in some ways, speed up in others. Education and intelligence. AI is definitely going to have a huge impact on our intelligence as a species, which will probably have a pretty dramatic impact on evolution, although that's going to be a much more diffuse impact, and it'll happen over the long run. But imagine that like 2,000 years from now, everyone has an IQ equivalent of like 180 or 200, right? Imagine that everyone born 2,000 years from now is 5 standard deviations higher IQ than everyone alive today. And so then it's like, I don't think it's going to be the way that Neil deGrasse Tyson said, that like it's not like we're going to learn calculus by age 3. I think that the way that that'll play out is that we actually learn for longer periods of time. Now that's going to suck for some people that hate school, because imagine being in school for 80 years. But when you have that much to learn and that much capacity, it might take longer, but your capacity to learn might be much, much higher. Not really sure how that's going to happen. It could also be faster. Post-scarcity economics will drastically alter our identity and priorities, which again might change our relationship to the idea of evolution and family planning. And family planning under all this context will be very different. And this comes down to sexual selection, which is who do you have children with, how many children do you have, when, why, so on and so forth. So basically, evolution, the long and short of it, evolution is going to be impacted in countless small ways by AI, and probably a few really big ways. So I hope you found this interesting and entertaining. Thanks for watching. Remember, support me on Patreon and all the ads go away permanently. Take care.